Welcome back, parents. I am so excited to be with you again on a wondrous day on our quest. You are almost at the end. This is the last week on this quest. You have been through so many profound shifts, I am sure. Maybe there's a part of you that's feeling a little bit confused or a little bit weird or a little bit different. Whatever you're feeling, just know I've been through it as well, and hundreds, if not thousands of other parents are probably experiencing the same thing you are. So understand, change is never easy. I mean, just last week, I challenged you to let go of your role as mom and dad and replace it with an entirely new, energetic way of being. This is something you've never done before. So, of course, it's going to feel kind of strange and kind of new. This is to be expected, isn't it? So, allow yourself the time and space, and most of all, great compassion as you go through this very steep and intense learning curve. So, let's talk about one other mythology that we're going to debunk today. It's all about control. You know, the traditional parenting paradigm dictates, in fact, it gives us this carte blanche mandate that as parents, we get to be in supreme control over our children. And, you know, that's why you've seen the latest trends of the tiger parent or the helicopter parent. All of these labels and these ways of being come from a singular presumption that parents have a sacred obligation to control and dictate their children. Now, this whole notion that parents have this obligation to control their children, or parents should control their children, this is a mythology. So let's talk about why this exists and what's actually behind this insatiable desire we have as parents to control our kids. I can still remember this one client that came to me that was really having a hard time giving up control over his son. Jacob was struggling with his son, Matthew. You know, Matthew was slightly overweight and was constantly being teased by his peers. He was one of those kids who wasn't very sporty or athletic. And this was a really sore point with his father, Jacob, because Jacob was one of those ultra jockey men who played basketball with his friends every weekend, who loved to compete, who loved to be in races. So imagine him with a son like Matthew. It was in fact inconceivable to Jacob that he would even produce such a son as Matthew that wasn't athletic. Jacob just couldn't wrap his head around the fact that his son turned out to be the way he did. So because he was in denial of the reality and because he couldn't accept it, like many of us parents, what do? We try to contort the reality. So Jacob too began to push his son. He began to train him incessantly for sports. He tried to convert Matthew into his ideal child, the child of his fantasy, not the child that he was. And he was going to change Matthew at all costs. So quite naturally, like our children often do, Matthew resisted greatly. There were innumerable fights in the house. There was non-stop conflict. It took several months for Jacob in therapy to begin to open up. And after a lot of prodding, he began to explore his own childhood. You know, he wouldn't have even come for therapy if it hadn't been for his wife. You know, his wife had to literally drag him for therapy because she began to notice the untold effects on their son, Matthew. When Jacob began to explore his own psyche and his own patterns, his own past, his own parental archetypes, he began to share how he too was raised by a very strict father. And he was pushed early on, you know, in the prototypical way sons typically are, to be a man and to not have tears and not have feelings. He was pushed to be competitive, to win at all costs. So Jacob, as a young boy, never really learned to explore his feelings and talk about owning his own destiny. He was never given a chance to claim his own destiny. And it's the same emotional legacy that, without him realizing, he was now passing on to his son. It was only after a lot of deep inner work, and let me tell you, it took a long time for Jacob to begin to undo his inherited cultural and parental dictates. Many parents, and maybe you're experiencing this yourself, have a great resistance. Maybe you're extremely afraid to look into your past. Maybe you're holding on to the memory that you had a happy childhood, and that memory is very important for you. And trust me, I'm not taking away the memory. Maybe you did have a happy childhood. Doesn't mean you haven't inherited dictates that are now blocking your ability to connect with your child. Are you in your own life beginning to see how you may be passing on unresolved feelings from your own childhood onto your child? And how we often disguise our manic control over our children in the name of caring? What Jacob later came to realize after several months is that his desire to control his son was really a distraction from the control over his own self. You see, he never had control over his own voice or over his own future, his own life, because his father had robbed him of this power over his own sense of self. He didn't think anything to rob his son from his control over his destiny. As children, we all feel a sense of helplessness when we are supremely controlled by our parents. And this helplessness, as we grow up, gets transformed into a great desire to control. That tyrant dictator you see ruling over some country out there, that man who never knew his own feelings that now seeks to control nations. Well, that tyrant just doesn't get born in a day. That tyrant is constructed carefully over decades after feeling a deep inner sense of helplessness. It's that helplessness that turns into this narcissistic rage. When we as children are robbed out of the immeasurable, incalculable gift of owning our own authentic selves, it's then that we see no compunction in robbing another of that freedom that they have. So Jacob, like most parents who awaken, began to see how his attempts to control his child was actually deeply rooted in his own helplessness and fears. He was afraid. He was feeling helpless that if his son did not follow the prescription that he grew up with, then how would his son turn out happy or successful? So you see, we get abducted from our authentic sovereign self, and we rob our children of their sovereign self. And then when we do this to our children, they begin to develop this enormous sense of helplessness, this lack of inner governance, this lack of trust in who it is they are. They lose their sense of inner direction because, you see, they've never been trained or allowed to look to themselves. They are always looking to the outside. So imagine they're constantly looking for the outside person or thing to give them a sense of validation. And this is where our children begin to live in a dysfunctional way. And it doesn't just stop at childhood. It doesn't just stop with an anxious child or an angry child. No, the child begins to carry these patterns into adult relationships. As a result of looking for external validation so hungrily, so cravingly, now they begin to enter relationships where they seek to be controlled by the other or seek to control the other or both, a combination of both. How can they not? This is all they know. So now that we understand how toxic and potentially dangerous and kind of useless it is for us to defend this manic desire we have to control our children, perhaps now we can begin to see that there may be other conscious alternatives out there. We know from the previous lessons on this quest that in some ways our children don't need a parent. They need a deeply connected spiritual guide, a mentor that allows them to discover who it is they are without pushing them in a certain way. In my own life, in my quest to look for another conscious alternative way to parent my child, I began to reframe my entire relationship with this idea of control. I began to embrace an awareness that yes, I was the caregiver, but I wasn't the commander-in-chief. Sure, I was in charge of the safety and the overall health and the environment, the conditions that were created around my child, but I began to release this idea that in any way was I the commander over my child's unique spirit. I began to see myself more and more as a co-creator of the conditions, but leaving my daughter to have the ultimate last word on how her destiny manifested for herself. You know, there is a huge difference between being a caregiver, full of care and loving compassion, and being a commander-in-chief. And this is my challenge to you, to begin to see the different energetic stances of both and begin to shift out of that desire to control and to command our children into a more softer energetic posture of being a caregiver for our children. You know, being in command means to be very invested in how the outcome of our children's growth and their entire life will be. It means to be deeply attached to the ways in which our children think and feel and what they believe in. We even want them to believe in things that we believe in how they conduct themselves, in how they make decisions, in how they show up for themselves. Now, let's move on to how a caregiver has a different energy. So being a caregiver allows us to be in the role of guide, but it shifts the energy from control to being an ally, to being a befriender of our children's spirits. We begin to usher them into their growth, but we do so without an attachment to our own agendas or to the outcome of who our children will be in the future. So a spiritual guide really empowers children to make conscious choices for themselves. A guide paves the path, perhaps, and shines the light, but ultimately reminds the children that when they get connected to their own inner knowing, they will discover the right answers for themselves. Yes, it demands that we parents release all this control, release all this desire to know and to manage and to contour and to engineer. Yes, it demands this acute release. But in its place, what we get is the allowance for our children to discover their own voice. Now, isn't that incalculably precious? You know, we're always trying to prevent our children from making mistakes. That's why we want to control them. We want to make sure that they do not fail. Yet science has shown that the most tremendous grit and resilience doesn't come from a lack of failure, doesn't come from perfection. It comes from a different kind of relationship to failure. In fact, I believe that when we allow our children to see themselves as fallible, when we allow them to see themselves as perhaps failing once in a while, when they see us as enduring failure, then they actually develop a gritty attitude toward failure. They don't get scared of failure. They embrace failure as an inevitable part of success. So for today's task, and again, it's a task of deep reflection. So give yourself some time, take out that journal. We're going to turn the eyes inward. We're going to really look at ourselves around this whole notion of control and management of our children, and we're going to begin to reflect on the following points. The first thing I'd like you to reflect on is to begin to examine the areas of conflict that you are currently engaging with your children. If you are dealing with an adult child, it's okay. Even then, try to observe if there's any unspoken tension or hidden conflict that you haven't visibly explored. Write about that. What is the area of conflict? Where do you find yourself clashing with your children? Take a few moments to reflect on that. I believe that most of our conflict really comes out of this insatiable desire that we have to control our children and their destiny. So this is why I want you to explore the areas of conflict. And then the second thing I'd like you to begin to reflect on is to begin to answer the question, why do I believe that this conflict even arises? What do I attribute as the source? When you were being a parent the old way, I'm pretty sure you would blame the kid. Now let's examine where the responsibility lies. I don't want you to blame anyone, but I would like you to examine, where does the responsibility lie for this conflict? Where does it come from? Then the third thing I would like you to reflect upon is, what does your child want? What do you as the parent want? And who is the one who needs to release the agenda? Am I, as the parent, for example, truly operating in the service of my child's highest self, or am I operating out of my thirst for my agenda? The fourth thing I'd like you to examine and reflect on is whether you can start releasing your agenda a little bit. Can you start letting go of your control? What areas in the conflict, what things in the debate or the argument can you begin to release? And then finally, notice the resistance that's coming up. You are instituting control only because you actually deeply care for your children. The care is just in the misplaced direction. You're afraid that there will be some catastrophic consequence in the future. So talk about that. What is your fear? It's this fear that is making you resistant to give up control. If you didn't have this fear, you'd give up the control right away. So let's go to that fear, let's examine it, and let's begin to explore what it would mean to give up control altogether. It's never easy to give up control. In fact, giving up control is possibly not only the hardest thing a parent will do in life, but a human being. None of us want to give up control. For us, giving up control is akin to dying. But it is only when we die to our false belief systems, our false ways of being, that we actually liberate our authentic self. Keep reflecting, share with the tribe, and I will see you back here tomorrow.